Welcome back to Between Two Wars. In this section, we're going to talk about the Great Depression of 1930 and the Bonus March. Starting off with the Great Depression of 1930. So now it came to pass. But to many, it wasn't a surprise. Some time ago, when my great-grandfather was still alive, I spent some time with him. It was in his late 80s, early 90s. And often I'll come to my aunt's house where he lived, and we spend time, passing the time, talking about things in the past, smoking cigars and drinking brandy. He was a young man at the time when the Great Depression hit. He was recently married to his wife, my great-grandmother, and you can see a picture right there of me in the middle there. This is when he was younger, when he was young, mid-70s. But it was during his marriage that all hell broke loose. And the Great Depression, as we know, officially started on Black Thursday, when on October 24th, 1929, the day that they opened on a Thursday, investors became panicked. For some reason, the notion of selling stocks became more important than buying stocks. And that one day, the average plunged 11%. But it didn't just happen in one day. This lasted for several days afterwards, about 5 days. Officials in the government and with the stock exchange attempted to control the panic by stopping shares and any sales of shares whatsoever. It did not work, needless to say. For when they opened it, even for 3 hours on the following day, the 25th, sales still went down further. And they waited over the weekend. They tried the following week. It finally hit ground. The stock market had failed. And with it, the unemployment followed very soon afterwards. My great-grandfather told me stories about how people in the years leading up to the stock market crash were still having a hard time. His brother had a prominent shirt factory. It went bankrupt very quickly, interestingly enough, prior to the stock market crash. As my great-grandfather shared with me, it was about the year or two beforehand he noticed that people stopped buying new shirts, stopped buying new shoes. People just did not buy things anymore because they couldn't afford it. The wages and salaries were too low. The cost of living had risen at that point. And it's funny, as he pointed out, how farms were being sold before the crash took place. But as he said, it took guys jumping out of buildings in New York to finally realize that the economy was just not good for the average working man. And it didn't just affect men. Children, wives, and homes. People who had property lost it. Farmers, for example, lost a lot of farm property because they couldn't afford to keep up the market as the price of goods, for example, potatoes, pigs, things of that nature, prices fell. Some farmers went on to try to get involved in the stock market, bought stock, only to lose everything, including their farms. In my other side of the family, they lost the farm and forced to move to the city to make ends meet. To our family, it's a devastating time. And the stories I heard from my father's side of the family were also devastating. I had my grandfather's brother, Uncle George, tell me how he received a telegram to come home as he couldn't afford to pay for his college education anymore. My Uncle George at the time was living in Philadelphia, attending University of Pennsylvania. His apartment was on the corner around Broad and Pine Street. He often told me stories about how he amused himself by looking out this window, watching prostitutes and people of that nature doing their business. But it was no more. He had to come home. But he was lucky. He had a home to come home to. Some folks didn't even have that. And the implications of that really slid down harder and harder as people lost their homes, their jobs, people were no longer buying things. It kind of sounds familiar right now. But with that, what they don't say too much about is crime increased. A hungry person will get desperate and will do things to make ends meet, one way or the other. My great-grandfather worked for what we call my Uncle Dell. He was a man who owned a very prominent funeral home, and interestingly enough, he had the county rights to public murders and crime and such. Around the Chicago area, Uncle Dale really cleaned up, in a matter of speaking. And my grandfather was able to get a job working for one of Uncle Dale's pickup men where they pick up the bodies. As my great-grandfather would often tell me, sometimes he had to bring a shovel. As he pointed out to me, using a .45 caliber machine gun at close range, well, there wasn't much left to pick up. And he pointed out to me that back then, it really got bad. On the other hand, though, you had other people, family members. One of my other great-grandfathers was a hobo. And he managed to ride the rails, they say. Thing is, the towns didn't like hobos too much. He would put these signs up saying, "Jobless men keep going," things of that nature. They have hobo camps. People come to camps and stay in them. As my great-grandfather Art would tell me, you're lucky to get a ride inside a boxcar. You have some shelter from the wind, the cold, the rain. And you wind up in places that you never saw before. But you had to keep moving before the goons or the bosses, as they called them, security guards, the railroads, would catch you. But during his time traveling around, I remember him showing me, not me personally, but remember showing our family signs and things of this nature. And I found something about the signs that hobos would leave behind, so that when someone's traveling to a town, they could look at and see what's going on. They go there and see a place with jails, free telephone, watch out for a barking dog, man's got a gun, tramps, other people of that nature, keep quiet in some areas, or talk religion and get food. Here's a picture of the man I speak of, the hobo. That would be my Uncle Art. Actually, my great-grandfather Art. Interestingly enough, he was able to get a job in the Depression afterwards and did quite well for himself, working as a puzzle maker. But to him, it was a different time. But for others, well, for the country, it was terrible. Real output and prices fell fast, precipitously. If you were selling something, it wasn't worth the selling of some things. As I mentioned, but farmers couldn't sell their vegetables, their crops, pigs, or meats, because they couldn't afford to make ends meet anymore. And when losing the mortgage, the bank would take it over, and the farm would sit fallow. Nothing be grown, nothing be raised. And with that, with factories also closing down, ultimately, with the United States, the industrial production in the United States declined 47%, and gross domestic product fell 30%. The American economy was collapsing. But if that wasn't bad enough, real trouble soon appeared. The bonus march. Now, some may remember, but I suspect many forget. The bonus army were veterans of the World War I era who served. And during that time, they were promised a cash payment bonuses. Unfortunately, for bonuses, many wouldn't receive it till sometime, in some cases, 1945, well after they served. Now understand, at the time, there was no Secretary of Veterans Affairs. Veterans were pretty much left on their own after they served in the war. They didn't get a whole lot of benefits out of this, like they supposedly have now. So during the time of Depression, out of work, many veterans started banding together nationwide to try to find a way to get their cash awards or their cash redemption sooner than later. And what had become started? A small group of men in Seattle, Washington, spread nationwide like wildfire. So, in December of 1931, there was, interestingly enough, a small, what they say, communist-led hunger march in Washington. A few weeks later, a Pittsburgh priest led an army of 12,000 jobless men to agitate for unemployment legislation. Now remember, back at the time, there was no unemployment, no Social Security, no veteran benefits. In March, a riot at Ford's River Rouge plant in Michigan left 4 dead and over 50 wounded. So when a cannery worker named Walter Walters began arriving in the capital in May with a group of bonus marchers, things started really building up and taking off. They called themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Forces, which was a twist on the old American Army presence in World War I in France, known as the American Expeditionary Forces, demanding an early payment of bonus Congress had promised them for the service in World War I. Now remember, this is something they were promised, not something they made up or demanded. So, they took place in the context of 1932, where nearly, or just about, 32,000 businesses failed. Unemployment had soared to about 25%, leaving roughly one family of every four without any money or breadwinning. 2 million people wandered the country in a futile quest for work. Many of the homeless settled in communities in makeshift shacks called Hoovervilles, after present-day blame for their plight, Herbert Hoover. Police Chief Glassford in Washington, D.C. knew he had to create some sort of Hooverville of his own to house the bonus army, but didn't know where. In the end, he chose attractive land known as the Anacostia Flats at the outer reaches of the District of Columbia, which could be reached from Capitol Hill only by a wooden drawbridge spanning the Anacostia River. So Glassford oversaw the establishment of the camp as best as he could. Mind you, he was doing his own what little money he could get from the city, making sure that at least a certain amount of building materials, lumber, nails, such, were supplied. The chief solicited food from local merchants and later added $773 of his own pocket provisions. Now again, mind you, the federal government didn't do this. D.C. wasn't a state, but he had no help from any agency except on his own. A police chief trying to avoid problems. So the first contingent of bonus army marchers arrived on May 23rd. Over the next 2 months, an estimated 25,000 more, with wives and children tagging along to state their claim what they felt was their due. In all, an estimated number of anywhere between 50 to 70,000 people, men, women, and children, were encamped just outside Washington, D.C. Now, some little bit of history. There are 3 people involved in this, aside from Chief Glassford. The man who in charge of military presence for that area was a guy named Douglas MacArthur, speaking with a guy named George Patton, commander of the cavalry forces, and MacArthur's aide, a guy named Dwight Eisenhower. Now, this part of the story is, I'll share, something learned from my grandmother's eldest brother, Eugene Price. That's with his dad over here. And that's my great uncle was serving in World War I. He even served in the Chinese legation prior to World War I. He was a military man in his life. But at one point, he lost the military benefits owing to a card fight with an officer who cheated. Well, this is well and good, except what my Uncle Arthur did was he threw the man off the train. And so for punishment, rather than be put in jail in Fort Leavenworth, he was drummed out of the military. He lost his main way to make money. So he participated in the bonus march also. And prior to his death, he shared stories with us about what was going on then. And what's interesting, that I wrote down this quote. I remember very well what he said to my father and everybody else in the family. The feeling had gotten really ugly when they started burning our shacks. If we had guns, Hoover and the rest of them, referring to Congress, were dead men, plain and simple. That's the point that my Uncle Arthur was pointing out to us. It was that serious. And as for the whole effort of the bonus army, it grew. Here's a shot of them riding the rails. Many of them gathered at one point from the West Coast, eventually congregated on Kansas City because that was the main train yard leading to East Coast trains. And at Kansas City, a lot of the police looked the other way because, as one officer explained in history, I'm not going to stop them. They outnumber us. And indeed, they came from all around. I found this picture because at the very front you see a pay bonus, Racine, Wisconsin. That was the gathering that my Uncle Art went with. And I found this picture about this. Very interesting. This gives you a small snapshot of how many people were there on the steps of the Capitol. And over here is Camp Marps, the encampment outside of Washington where they all stayed and gathered, and where Chief Glassford got materials for people to build their homes temporarily. But in time, they were not welcomed. As Congress voted down the bonus payment, the reaction was pretty strong. As Congress pointed out, they didn't feel they couldn't do it, and Hoover argued that it would bankrupt the country. In fact, counter arguments were brought out that said, why don't we just do a partial payment? And unfortunately, Hoover, as he pointed out to folks and others, he felt that these were mainly bums looking for money. And so, things got out of hand pretty fast. Here's a picture shot of the tanks that were brought in, early tanks. These were not under the command of George Patton, however. These gentlemen were, however. Patton got called out in the cavalry and was ordered to start rounding up and chasing them out of the camps. And at one scary point, the story goes, that was shared by my uncle, and when I reading articles about this in the history, is when sabers were drawn, they began to charge. My uncle said it was something out of Russia, looking at these guys wearing these hats, charging with swords. But then that particular charge stopped when this gentleman, Joe Angelo. This gentleman was really something that was exceptional. He was from Camden, New Jersey, and he walked all the way from Camden to Washington, D.C. And during his time in World War I, at the Battle of Cambrai, George Patton was nearly killed by German machine gunners. He was severely wounded, but Joe dragged him back to the aid station and kept him alive. For this, he got a medal, as you see his writing, you see right there. In the face of overwhelming enemy fire, he saved a fellow American and brought him down to an aid camp. If it weren't for Joe Angelo, you wouldn't see George Patton in World War II. So, facing a squad of cavalry led by Patton, the time they started attacking on Camp Marks, Joe Angelo stood off in the crowd, walked forward to him, shouting shame to him, telling him, "Don't you remember who I am? I saved your life. How can you do that to the rest of your fellow veterans?" Patton, in his one time in his career, as it said, he always attacked. Well, we'll say rarely. He rarely retreated. In this case, he retreated. Ordering his troops to turn around, he retreated. Patton received a lot of hell from Douglas MacArthur for doing this. It was Patton who said that Douglas MacArthur to go to hell because he wasn't going to kill fellow Americans. And Joe later on really exemplified something interesting. During the congressional inquiry of this whole incident at the Bonus March, Joe was asked to testify. Joe's testimony didn't just detail what happened at Camp Marks, but more importantly, he pointed out how soldiers needed better respect for serving for our country. And his testimony regarding the Bonus March, as well as his insight of what happened and why men needed money, laid a foundation of administration and veterans affairs. In many ways, Joe truly served both fellow veterans as well as his country. And it still went on, though. Eventually, the houses were burned. People ran. My uncle Art was telling me how they were using bricks and throwing bricks at soldiers, calling them young punks or calling them young kids, but eventually they couldn't do anything against bayonets or guns. The bonus marches were moved, but only temporarily. What actually happened was they returned later on. But in the meantime, after the bonus march, it was over Hoover and Republicans. For either taking a full force of military, harming both veterans and the families who came along, Franklin Roosevelt won handily the elections, and the mistrust of Republicans lingered for several decades afterwards. But later on, the marches returned upon Roosevelt's election. But Roosevelt did something different. He immediately started to work, creating the foundations of the WPA, New Deal Public Works, and the Conservation Corps, figuring that it's better to get people working than rioting. But in the meantime, as several thousands of campers or bonus marches returned to meet the growing crowd, Roosevelt had a challenge. So rather than sending armed forces, he sent his wife Eleanor, travel to meet the marchers as they enjoyed a series of sing-alongs while receiving hot meals. Eleanor did inform them of their options for jobs, detailing the WPA, the New Deal Public Works. By 1933, of the 3,000 who were in the camp, 2,600 accepted these new jobs. As it was said at the time, and worth remembering, Hoover sent the army. Roosevelt sent Eleanor. The march was over, and the New Deal had begun. It was a different phase for the Great Depression. I hope you enjoyed this brief thing. I'm going to try this new format rather than just have you read a PowerPoint. If you have any questions, contact me. If you like it, let me know. If you didn't like it, let me know. I'd rather do it this way personally because I think it's better than just reading something dry. But it's a start. Thanks for listening. Take care.